Awesome. We are going to get started here. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for all being here. We have a wonderful panel event for us here tonight. I'm going to give myself an introduction and then give a little bit of logistical details and information about how the program is going to run, and then we will get started. So my name is Justin Douglas. I use pronouns he, him. I'm a third-year grad student in the Joint Social Work and Public Policy program here at the University of Chicago. And I am the graduate assistant for the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs. And I also serve as the president for the Black Graduate Coalition. Moving right along, I want to first sort of introduce the different offices that are sponsoring this event here tonight. So first we have the Office of Spiritual Life. So reporting to Rockefeller Chapel, the Office of Spiritual Life serves as a destination for all things spiritual and religious at the University of Chicago. They address the complexities of religious encounter in the 21st century and provide a space for members of the university community to ask big and small questions about meaning and purpose. Next, another sponsor of this event is the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, or OMSA. OMSA creates intentionally diverse and inclusive communities, serving as a bridge builder by engaging students and members of the university community of all backgrounds to ensure personal, academic, and professional growth and success. Lastly, we're happy to be sponsored by the Center for Leadership and Involvement, or the CLI. The CLI is a multifaceted office that encourages student involvement at the University of Chicago and provides learning opportunities in ways as diverse and valuable as possible, while enhancing the unique culture of the university. As folks are coming in, I'd like you to sort of use Zoom to put it on speaker view. That way, when panelists are highlighted or the panelists are up together on screen, you can sort of transition with the program. So the way that this program is going to work, the first 45 minutes will be a panelist discussion with our moderator, and then the last 30 minutes will be reserved for Q&A. When or if you have a question for the Q&A portion, please send a message to Adrian, who is the host, and you can see that in your chat box. If you press the little bar, you can send direct questions to Adrian, and Adrian will relay that to the panelists. Now let's get into this program. I want to introduce all of our fantastic panelists. First, we have Dr. Kwok Pui Lan. Dr. Kwok Pui Lan is Dean's Professor of Systematic Theology at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. She has published extensively in feminist theory, biblical hermeneutics, and postcolonial criticism. She is the author or editor of numerous books in Chinese and English, including Postcolonial Imagination and Feminist Theology, Globalization, Gender, and Peacebuilding, and Occupy Religion, Theology of the Multitude, with Joerg Reiger. She is working on a volume on postcolonial politics and theology. Next, we have Dr. Angie Heo. Angie Heo is on the faculty at the University of Chicago Divinity School. She is broadly interested in minority politics, interfaith relations, and global religious movements. As an anthropologist of religion, media, and economy, her research so far has focused on true traditions, Eastern Orthodoxy, and evangelical Protestantism, and has explored two geographic regions, the Middle East and East Asia. She is a second-generation Korean American who enjoys living abroad and navigating life in the hyphen. Finally, we have Steve Nunez, who received a Master of Theological Studies degree in Religion, Ethics, and Politics from Harvard Divinity School in 2018, and is currently a third-year PhD student at the University of Connecticut, studying Africana philosophy, decolonial thought, philosophy of racism, existential phenomenology, Black aesthetics, philosophy of education, and carceral and abolition studies. His tentative dissertation project surrounds the politics and ethics of revolutionary counterviolence through the philosophical thought of Franz Fanon. He teaches courses across UConn, including philosophy and social ethics, gender and sexuality in everyday life, and global existentialism. During summers, he adjuncts at his alma mater, the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, instructing a course called Racism and the American Liberal Imagination. Steve is an alumni member of the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign, actively organizes with the UConn Defund and Divestment Project, and is excited to help build a grassroots abolitionist movement transforming the political landscape of North Carolina with the Carolina Federation. When he's not reading, writing, and organizing, Steve loves to cook and bake, is an avid photographer, and loves trap music. Last but not least, our moderator, Anna Duong-Topp, is a first-year MA student at the University of Chicago Divinity School and program assistant for the UChicago Spiritual Life office. Her research focuses on new Japanese religiosities and their relationships with modern race relations. She has established herself as the social justice arm of the Spiritual Life office and loves to have uncomfortable conversations in this regard. When she's not studying or working, Anna enjoys painting and FaceTiming her cats, who are currently living with her parents in Minnesota. Again, I want to thank all of these phenomenal folks for being here tonight. And with that, I will turn the time over to our moderator, Anna.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Justin, and thank you, panelists, for being here and sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you so much to everyone who's registered and taking the time to contemplate these hard questions with us. And so to quick start us off, I want to give us a very amorphous look at what we might be tackling here today. We're, in a word, going to be looking at decolonization, which is extremely complicated. And that's exactly why I've assembled some people who I really think are doing fantastic work at kind of wrestling with and defining this term, especially as it relates to human people with real experiences. So to start us off, we'll start with this very complex question. As a creator of this event, I have been tasked with centering us on some semblance of a definition of decolonization. But as you panelists likely know, decolonization is very difficult to define, and definitions that do emerge are very easy to contest. So for now, I would like to focus on cultural decolonization, defining it as a process which dismantles hegemonic influence in a manner that allows for colonized people to reclaim their cultural heritages. I want to offer up to our discussion, how could this definition be improved in the context of culturally decolonizing the Christian church? And is this term decolonization subject to misuse in this context? I'm gonna call on Angie Heo first.
Now I know what it's like to be a student.
Sharing the love.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, thanks. Anna, I really appreciate the question, and it's always brave to come up with a working definition. As you so mentioned, often you put a definition out there, it creates a discussion and a conversation, often in the terms of contest. So I really appreciate the courage there that you offer us. I'd like to thank Anna Duong-Topp for inviting me here, Spiritual Life and the Office of Multicultural Affairs at the University of Chicago for their kind invitation to this discussion. So I'd like to start on the question of this definition that Anna's offered us. So I think it's important to recognize first the definition. That definition is a historically specific one. And this definition asks us to consider at minimum three concepts together: hegemony, colonized people, and cultural heritage. And in this definition, the ultimate task for overcoming colonization is the ability to reclaim one's cultural heritage. That is, as I heard it, the definition proposes the solution is a project of reclamation, cultural reclamation. And so I think I want to just offer some examples that I see of this project occurring in my life. And since it's spiritual life, I can't help but just begin with my yoga class, because I'm missing yoga class to be here right now. And I'd like to share that I miss my yoga class, and my instructor is a white woman from Hyde Park, and she's very intentional about using Sanskrit during the poses. And I think a lot of this is motivated by her kind of participation in anti-racism seminars with yoga instructors. And I think the idea, although I've never discussed it with her at length, is the idea that reclaiming Sanskrit, at least the linguistic heritage in yoga practice, may do some work for advancing anti-racism and the decolonization of yoga in the US. I think that is one example, and a small example, of how people understand the cultural politics of decolonization in spiritual practices, if one takes yoga to be a spiritual practice. But I think it's also will be useful to briefly contrast this definition with the aims and aspirations of other political projects of decolonization. And here I'm thinking of other historical contexts of struggle. So for example, in 1945, the global end of colonialism, which was inaugurated by the end of World War II, we can think about the imagination of decolonization really taking shape in Africa, Asia, and Latin America in this period. And here, I just want to point out that I don't think these anti-colonial nationalists were really interested in reclaiming cultural heritage. I think they're, and I'm not, I'm just offering that cultural decolonization is just one kind of part. But as a political project, they were interested in nationalism and anti-colonial nationalism. And this was a decolonizing project at its core. These nationalists, these were interested in building nation states, erecting strong economies. For some of this meant building military and police power and autocracies, and for others, few others, unfortunately, meant establishing democracies. So I think, kind of placing this definition of cultural decolonization within kind of the formal end of decolonization after World War II might be an interesting tension to kind of play with, especially since I'll be considering more kind of the formation of global Christianity in places outside of the American context. I do want to say, though, I am interested in discussing the particular definition that Anna offered to us, because I think it speaks to a discourse of decolonization that's specific to our American political present. So I want to explicitly put out there that I'm very aware that American colonialism, the history of American colonialism, is one of labor extraction from slave trade, is one of settler colonialism and the domination of indigenous communities. And that when I hear that term being invoked by Anna, I hear her specifically referring to these American-specific context of decolonization and how to grapple with the effects of racism in our contexts in the American Academy today. So I just want to acknowledge that the difference, but also acknowledge and recognize the purchase of your definition, Anna.
Thank you so much, Dr. He. That was beautiful. Steve, I noticed some very vigorous nodding from you. I wonder if perhaps you have a response to some of Dr. He's comments.
Not so much as a response, but Dr. He hit a lot of the things that I've been thinking about. It's always hard for me. A lot of times it's easier for me, just disclosure. Anna sent us these questions a couple of weeks ago, so I've been thinking on it, and it's hard in a short amount of time to get it all out. But yeah, so I really come to this conversation through Fanon. So Franz Fanon is a Martinican psychiatrist who ended up fighting with the FLN And in his famous Anglophone translation, The Wretched of the Earth, there's this famous or infamous line that opens the book that says, "Decolonization is always a violent event." And to Dr. He's point, decolonization has lost a lot of the purchase that I see in the way that Fanon was thinking about it in this current context in which we find it. I mean, we could see corporations talking about decolonizing Nike or whatever it is at this point. So I think it's lost a lot of purchase. And I got to kind of organize these thoughts, but one way that I think part of my work is to reframe the way that Fanon thinks about decolonization, because that's a very misinterpreted interpreted line, and we don't have particularly the time. We can get into it maybe later if somebody has a question, but I think that Fanon really thinks of decolonization as a relationship of love. So in Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon defines authentic love as wishing for others that what one postulates for oneself, when that postulation unites permanent values of human reality, entails the mobilization of psychic drives basically freed of unconscious conflicts. So in a lot of ways, or in some ways, Fanon scaffolds and repurposes this intersubjective conception of authentic love to the societal level when he concluded a 1956 speech, Racism in Culture, with, quote, "Universality resides in this decision to recognize and accept the reciprocal relativism of different cultures once the colonial status is irreversibly excluded." So for Fanon, to Dr. He's point, a lot of the conversation around decolonization is very much around national state establishment and autonomy and the sovereignty. So I think part of what might be helpful from me is maybe thinking about, I think we use a lot of terms very interchangeably, particularly decolonization, post-colonization, decoloniality, coloniality. These are all very related terms, but a little bit different. In terms of colonialism, I mean, colonialism is central to this whole thing. So we can think of that as a sort of imperial nation state imposing and subjugating peoples and territories. It's a very, very violent event. So from there, we can think of coloniality as a framework that kind of undergirds these colonial relationships. So if colonialism is a relationship, then coloniality are the logics that undergird this relationship, that allow and justify these dominating violent relationships to occur. So in that sense, we might think of decolonization through Fanon, especially because he was an existentialist. So I think of decoloniality or decolonization. The zation at the end of that implies action, implies praxis, implies movement. So I think that is a helpful generative way to think about it, as a praxis aimed at the complete and permanent eradication of these logics, of these colonial logics. And I think to bring love back into this is kind of, or to bring love in, and I think one of the ways that I think about this is really important is the idea of creolization. I think that's sort of what Fanon is getting towards whenever he thinks of decolonization, is this idea that we're in this, right? We're in it. We got to live through it. We got to struggle through it. I don't foresee colonizers dying off the face of the planet in a rapture. So what do we do with this, right? How do we see each other in an intersubjective reciprocal light that values humanity and dignity and worth in this authentic kind of love that Fanon is really, really digging towards? So I'll leave it there because I took up a lot of space, but I think that's really, really important. And I guess one more note before we leave. I think also as this becomes a really, really important, an important and more popular conversation in popular minds to the definition that you have, I think it's important that we name also in terms of decolonization, what do we mean by the Christian church in this in this conversation? I'm not sure if we can discuss all Christian traditions equally. For example, I'm not sure it's all that helpful to talk about decolonizing Thomas Jefferson's church in the same light as David Walker's, or Billy Graham's church in the same way as James Cone's. Not to mention, I think it's really important how we think about this question too. To think about, for me, the question immediately struck me as somewhat patronizing in its erasure of pre-modern, non-European, pre-colonial expressions of Christianity. So I think part of this question really comes to how we view history and how we view the progression of time in the future, and all sorts of really complicated things. But yeah, I think it's important that we take care while we think about this to realize that there are non-European, non-European Christians that were practicing Christianity far before the colonial period that we're discussing. So I will leave it there.
Thank you so much for your comments, Steve and Dr. He. I'm noticing that we really need to move on to the next question. I was in fact going to ask Dr. Kwok a question specifically, and I think that she will have some very rich things to offer us today. So I want to offer up specifically to Dr. Kwok, but hopefully we'll get to hear a little bit of discussion afterwards. So, Dr. Kwok, you begin in your 2005 book, Postcolonial Imagination and Feminist Theology, by saying this: I am interested in exploring the steps necessary for a postcolonial intellectual to dislodge herself from habitual forms of thinking, established forms of inquiry, and the reward system vigilantly guarded by the neoliberal academy. So I ask, how would you describe this dislodging process to those unfamiliar with the intersection of gender, colonialism, and Christianity?
I would like to thank Anna and also the Program for Spiritual Life for inviting me to join this wonderful conversation. This topic about how to dislodge our mind from the intersection of colonialism, gender, and Christianity has been with me for a long time. And I want to share with you what I have been thinking by reference to two particular paintings. One is this famous one, America, by this painting artist, Jan van der Straat. And here you have a nude woman that is in the background of this last new world and greeting the European man who stands on the shoreline before her and carrying a cross in his right hand. And so here you have a very interesting depiction of the new and the old world interacting, and then the native women portrayed as feminine. Now contrast this with another one. This one is a painting by Jones Parker around the mid-19th century. And this shows Queen Victoria sending this African chief a Bible. Now you have to note that the Bible was conceived not in England. No English person has written anything on the Bible. But now this is as a commodity given to the chieftain. And this is clearly depicting the civilizing mission. And so in order to contest the so-called white man's burden or the colonial and civilizing mission and supported by some form of the missionary movement, I have written this book, Postcolonial Imagination and Feminist Theology. The first monograph by one person introducing postcolonial theory to Christian theology. And here I focus on several things. How to dislodge our mind from imperialism. Well, we have to think about how gender works. In those two paintings, how gender works. And I am sorry to say, among the many white feminist theologians, they have not talked much about gender and imperialism in a very sustained way. When we talk about women's experience in doing theology or understanding Christianity, one obvious question to ask is, whose women's experience? Is it white, middle-class women's experience, or the so-called subaltern, or the subjugated women, the formerly colonized women? Would they be able to contribute their understanding of faith? Whereas in United States and also in Europe, the gender of God or the Savior has been a crucial issue, that is the pronoun. And I ask the question whether the same question is valid in other contexts. I just want to give you a simple example. In China, in classical Chinese, we do not have gender-specific pronouns. So there is one character, yu, that can mean man or woman. And in the 1920s, when we needed to translate he or she from English to Chinese, then we think about how to translate God. And instead of translating God as using the pronoun he, we created a third pronoun for God. So it was only when I came to the United States, worshiping in English-speaking church, and then I noticed, wow, that is really a problem, which I have not had that problem before. Well, it does not mean that the metaphor for God is not Father or Lord, but at least linguistically, different countries, different cultures, they might have different rendering of the pronoun of God. So this may or may not be the most important topic, and why focusing on culture and symbol, but not paying attention to the political or economic dimensions of oppression. And then I also want to emphasize, if we want to dislodge our mind from white hegemony, we need to have alternative worldview and also inhabit our mind with alternative voices. That is why we have to lift up the voices of women who are invisible or who are marginalized from the global south. I want to show this to show the audience the shift of Christian demographics. Why talking about decolonization of the mind is important. As you can see, in 2025, the projected Christian demographic would be like what we are seeing on the right-hand column. You have Africa with 634 million. That is the continent with the most Christians. And two places in the world, you have phenomenal growth in terms of Christian population. One is in Africa, the other in China, in case you do not know. So by 2050, only about 1/5 of the world's 3 billion Christians will be non-Hispanic white. So as this Christian demographic shift, this topic, decolonizing the church, would be very important. So I want just to say 4 things about what are the steps to decolonize the church. Last week, some of us observed the Holy Week. We retold the Christian story. How we are going to retell it will be very important. Jesus obviously was a political prisoner. Sometimes middle-class white Christianity forgets this, thinking that Jesus just saves me, individual person, from damnation, and then cleaned our sin, and then attained salvation. This is not the story to tell if we want to decolonize the church. Jesus died as a political prisoner on the crucifix so that other people who want to rebel the Roman Empire, they would be afraid, fearful, and would dare not challenge the status quo. Jesus gathered disciples, the crowd, and formed alternative communities. Sometimes people will say Jesus was a passive person, did not resist. Well, that is not quite true. On Palm Sunday, Jesus entered Jerusalem, and there was another procession. The other procession showed the military might of the Roman Empire. Jesus was also processing, but it was a different kind of procession. Yes, Jesus talks about nonviolent resistance. But we have to understand around Jesus, there were many different actors, and we cannot synthesize Jesus' movement as if it is completely passive and not resisting empire. We need to reform the liturgy and worship. Why this is necessary? When I was in Hong Kong, and then in our churches, we sang 19th century hymns only in translated text. Some of those may not be helpful in the colonial setting. We have to rededicate ourselves to Missio Dei, God's mission. What is God's mission? God's mission is reconciling the world. As we know that the world is very broken, we are facing three crises at the same time. Not only the coronavirus, but also economic inequity and racial discrimination and prejudice. So my question for all of us will be, how are we going to prepare the Christian community in the post-pandemic world? So I love to hear what others have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kwok. I think as evidenced by that wonderful presentation and that final slide, is just so particularly powerful, especially in the way that we think about empire, in the way that we think about resistance. And the word empire in particular really struck a chord with me in that last slide, the dichotomy between the two processions that were going on is such an epic image to focus on, I think, as we move forward. I think it particularly brings into question some things that I wondered when thinking about what to ask you, Steve, because you have spent time in the military. And yet here you are studying Africana philosophy, studying the diaspora, and doing a wonderful job at that. And so I wanted to ask a question, particularly in light of that context, about how that experience informed what you're doing today. And so I wonder, it is my understanding that you spent some time in the military before beginning your academic career and coming here to talk to us today. And you saw firsthand how war and religious hegemonies affect real people on the ground. What questions did this inspire for your academic pursuits, and what have you discovered so far about the relationship between the US empire and Christianity? Further, as a scholar of Africana philosophy, how, in your view, do these pillars affect the experiences of people of the African diaspora? I think the image that Professor Kwok showed of the African, I think, Lord just bowing, crumpling before the Bible is particularly prevalent. But I'll turn it over to you, Steve.
Thanks. This is a loaded question. Wow. Very interesting question, though. This extremely informative, and I guess kind of a little bit requires a little bit of biographical background. So my dad's Afro-Dominican, born in Santiago, República Dominicana, and my mother is a white woman. I moved to Wilmington, North Carolina when I was 5 years old. In Wilmington, North Carolina is where I came to consciousness, particularly around racism. As I grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina, I was 14 years old. I was a freshman in high school when 9/11 happened. It was hard to be outside of that hegemonic conversation. I think people often forget at the time, I think it was like a 99.5% approval rate of invading Afghanistan and Iraq, or one of the two. So the conversation was always around me. And I also found myself within this very American tradition of Blackness. The Battle of Forks Road, for example, that was fought in Wilmington, North Carolina, was won by 1,500 US colored troops. Wilmington falls 3 days later, and the Civil War ends a month later. Black men that fought for their own freedom from surrounding plantations around Wilmington that actually escaped enslavement and went and killed Confederate people for the freedom of Black people in the United States, was an important conversation that is floating in the sort of oral traditions that I find myself reading about and thinking about in Wilmington. I went to a high school called Eugene Ashley High School. Eugene Ashley was a Black Medal of Honor winner in Vietnam. So as a poor Black kid in Wilmington, North Carolina, not knowing what I was going to do after high school, especially hating school. I hated school. I hate the pedagogical imperatives that Western education places on people, and I found myself out of place. So I didn't want to go to university. I didn't have money to go to university. So my mom said, well, what are you going to do with your life? The Army offered me a $20,000 signing bonus and healthcare and all these sorts of things. And the 9/11 GI Bill was a huge reason why I enlisted. So for me, like nowadays, I really think, I guess, how I think, I think that's one of the reasons why we'll never get rid of student debt. I think if you get rid of student debt, there's no imperative to get poor people to enlist and fight your wars for you. So that really, really inspired 9/11, and my involvement in what transpired after 9/11 really, really inspired me to ask all sorts of questions. Because when I got to Afghanistan, I said to myself, at some point, I came to consciousness like, what the fuck is going on? Everything that I've ever been told about this place is an absolute bullshit lie. So I came to that sort of consciousness. And at some point I said, you know what? I don't know anything about Islam. I need to go and study Islam in the academy. And that's what kind of took me. And I did an undergraduate at UNCW, UNC Wilmington, in philosophy and religion. And anthropology. And then I went on to do an MTS at Harvard. And I think this really, really, I think is an important piece of that I kind of have been thinking about too, is how do we think about this as a university, right? I get to Harvard Divinity School. Harvard Divinity School is a colonial project, right? The university is a colonial project necessarily. Harvard University opens in 1636 and the Indian College opens in 1655. Harvard is a project to proselytize indigenous people into civilizing them to Christian sensibilities. So for me, that's really, really part of the question too, is we have seen historically the university. So what does the epistemology of coloniality look like? What does that look like in the United States of America? And can we decolonize universities? And what is that role specifically to the church? I think that's really important. UChicago's got a very, very prominent divinity school. How are they thinking about this question? I think is an important thing. How are clergy thinking about this question? I think is really, really important. So that is kind of really how I have come to consciousness and really, really have grown and matured in certain sorts of ways that I understand colonial contexts and my participation and the coerced participation that I had through poverty in you know what I mean? Like it's been a long praxis of thinking about how we deal with the things that we've done in the past. And I think, I guess I'll end with this. Fanon, I also share this very similar trajectory with Fanon. Fanon fought in World War II because he thought he was fighting a war for human dignity. And after being shipped back to Martinique on the bottom of boats by the French military, he realized that he was fighting, quote unquote, just another white man's war. And in a course, Africana philosophy course that I'm in a couple of weeks ago, the question came up, Fanon detested violence. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is I detest violence. I absolutely detest violence. I couldn't have come to this recognition without all the violence that I've done to people and being haunted by the noises that people make when you harm them. So yeah, this is central to my life. I couldn't have come to the detestation of violence and the pursuit of the abolition of the nation state as we know it and colonial relations without having done massive amounts of violence myself. And that's part of my own praxis in dealing with how I come to terms with that as I move along. So for the question, Anna, I hope I addressed a little bit of it or a portion of it. It's heavy, as you can see, for me. I carry a lot of weight around these questions of harm and violence and power. I think that's also a very, very important part of this question. At some point, I realized that oftentimes when we think about power, we use this term power. What we actually mean to refer to as violence in terms of a violation. That's the same root term than violation. So we think of power in terms of hegemony as this legitimated sort of violence. I think a lot of the times it's legitimated to the state. And I think these are things that I've come to terms with through my involvement in the practitioner of colonization and neo-colonization or quasi-colonization. And yeah, so I'll leave it there. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you so much, Steve, for sharing your story and touching on some very important points that I think everyone here is thinking of both intellectually and just emotionally, empathetically. Something that I want to discuss with all of you just as Q&A questions are coming in is something that both Dr. Kwok and Steve both touched on, is the dichotomy of violence and harm, and then that of passivity. Dr. Kwok, you mentioned that there is this misconception that Jesus kind of went into the crucifixion very passively. I think that the key term there is that it's a misconception. And so I'd like to discuss for a few minutes what exactly violence and I suppose submission mean in this conversation of church community and this ongoing project of, you know, very fraught decolonization and the historical implications of that.
I want to share with you how I have been thinking this question anew, given in the last 2 years, the world has witnessed the protests and demonstration in Hong Kong. I was born in Hong Kong, the former British colony. So I want to share with you, as the students are demonstrating in Hong Kong, what was I thinking? I think that as a graduate student, my first demonstration at Harvard, I was also a graduate of Harvard, was for the South African people's fight against apartheid. So looking from outside, I certainly understand that apartheid regime was very violent. And I pay attention to what Christian leaders like Archbishop Desmond Tutu has been saying in those very difficult situations. And as I was growing up, I also watched the Christians in South Korea, in Taiwan, in the Philippines, who at that time stood up against their dictatorial regimes. In Hong Kong, the situation was a little bit different. We did not have democracy, but we had much freedom. And then as the demonstration unfolded, as many of you recalled, at first it was very peaceful. That is, 1 million or 2 million in a city of only 7 million or so people. You can then recognize so many people demonstrated. And then the government did not listen to the people's cry and their 5 demands and did not want to negotiate with the people. So some of the people were very disappointed. And then you have the radical wing of the demonstrators throwing petrol bombs and other things. And while as you have the majority still supporting nonviolent movement. And in that particular situation, we have to emphasize institutional violence too. Sometimes our focus tended to be on those protesters. What did they do? And did they burn down buildings or did they destroy property? But we forgot, or we tend to overlook institutional violence in terms of the economy, in terms of political participation, in terms of the power of the police. And then it was very revealing for me to see not only the Hong Kong protests, but the American protests, the Black Lives Matter protests as well. And in fact, in the last 2 years, in many parts of the world, we had witnessed different kinds of people's movement. Why? Because the economic, political situation of the world is really untenable. And that is why I hope with this pandemic, and we as humankind will be given an opportunity to look at our relationships as humanity, not just divided according to nations or race, because the virus knows no boundary. And then when I was watching the Hong Kong situation, I began to think whether violence or non-violence can be so clearly divided. And that led me to see Jesus' movement anew. Jesus marched to Jerusalem. Wasn't that political theater? What did Jesus do? Overturning the table? Well, that is also very political gesture as well. And then it is not just you have a very peaceful movement and Jesus died on the cross. Not at all. There was one of the disciples who took out the sword and cut somebody's ear. Did you remember that? And then you have a lot of things happening during the final week, a lot of action. So I became aware of Candace Delmer's book, which talks about uncivil, not civil obedience, uncivil obedience. And what is the parameter for this uncivil obedience? And then I look at the gospel story, the last week of Jesus' life anew. What is nonviolence? What is civil disobedience? And what is uncivil disobedience? And then it opened up to a new way of engaging Jesus' politics that is not so sanitized. The sanitized version was Jesus was a non-violent fighter. When people accused him, he did not respond. He voluntarily and gave up his life for our sin. Well, that will be a very sanitized way of looking at the Bible. Now, how to retell the gospel in our broken and fragmented world that needs imagination? I like your first question. You talk about a process. It is indeed a process. My entering into the Holy Week was a new process for me in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kwok. I'm trying to pull up my moderating bootstraps, as that just radically silenced me. Some wonderful words in there. We're getting some excellent questions in for the Q&A. So with everyone's willingness, I hope that we can perhaps shift to those. And for this first question, I'm perhaps going to be a bit of a provocateur, and please chime in with your thoughts. Is Christian colonialism a natural inevitability of modern globalization? If so, isn't it unrealistic for us to condemn Christianity by associating it with colonialism, hegemony, or immoral practices?
Is it possible for you to put the question in the chat?
Sure. Let me copy and paste really quick. You able to see that?
I guess I don't think it's a natural inevitability of modern globalization. And I think in some ways, when Steve was mentioning that there are forms of Christianity that are unmoored from colonial histories, that is, there's nothing intrinsic to Christianity that makes it a Western imperial practice. One can think about the Desert Fathers, for example. I work in Egypt. That ascetic tradition in North Africa is from late antiquity and had nothing to do with modernization. I mean, it's, in fact, the reclamation project of that ancient tradition has also been appropriated in service of certain kind of authenticity politics. That is kind of alliances with early Christians and American and Arab alliances with. So I guess I don't agree, or I don't follow from the first question that it's a natural inevitability. And in fact, I would say, even if one were to suggest that Christianity in its greatest power is associated with Western domination and colonialism, I would say that it probably precedes modern globalization rather than is in, I wouldn't say that it's an outcome of modern globalization.
Thank you, Dr. Heo. Steve?
Yeah, I also, no, I don't see it as a natural inevitability. I don't think that's a helpful frame to think about anything. People are making deliberate choices to do these things. People are developing deliberate policies to do these things, and a lot of them are Christians. A lot of these are coming out of seminaries and theological thought. A lot of these justifications for colonization. So no, I don't think it's an inevitability. And because people are making choices, those choices come with responsibility. And I think given that, the second part of the question is, no, it's not unrealistic to condemn people that made these deliberate choices. I think that it's very ethical to condemn these people that made these deliberate choices to colonize other people and subjectify other people and attempt to dehumanize other people, because I don't think that is a totalizing dehumanization project, because that doesn't make sense. One has to recognize another as human in order to dehumanize them in the first place. It's an act of bad faith. You already know that they're human. So for me, yes, we ought to condemn people that do bad acts as we see them, and we can talk what those bad acts are and argue about what those bad acts are. But once we decide, I think that we can all agree, everybody in this room, I hope we can all agree that colonization was a bad thing that ought to be condemned. And I'll leave it there.
Dr. Kwok, did you have any thoughts on that?
I am allergic to the term naturally. Natural order, the natural order of things means that is the status quo. Those who are subjugated never defined or can define what is natural, because for them it's very unnatural. Modernization means Westernization. Well, for Westerners, it's so natural. For us, it's very unnatural, okay? And so I think to say natural, I think we need to debunk it. Nothing is natural. Everything is historical. Yes, I agree with Steve. People make choices. They can make up their mind in one way or the other. Colonization is not natural. It is not fulfilling God's creation order. It is absolutely against it.
Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts. I might have to steal that phrase from you, Dr. Kwok. I'm allergic to the word natural. I feel like I have a similar physical reaction to it. Our second question I will also post in the chat for our convenience. Oh, that is the same thing. Just one moment, let me scroll up to try to find. So this question is, what are some steps to decolonize the racial imagery of the church? Is the image of a European Jesus a part of a wider system of white supremacy? I'm gonna try to. I am not able to paste directly from the chat. So let me just repeat it one more time. What are some steps to decolonize the racial imagery of the church? Is the image of a European Jesus a part of a wider system of white supremacy?
I mean, the second part I think is easier to answer. Yes, I think it is. I think a white depicted Jesus is part of a project, a political, an aesthetic sensibility that aligns with white supremacy. And not necessarily, I mean, if one, okay, so let me complicate this. Also white liberal, white saviorism, right? So it's not just, you know, kind of certain separatist nationalists that want to revive racial purity of America as white. I mean, it's also could just be people who believe in multiculturalism and believe in the Savior Project. What are some steps to decolonize the racial imagery of the church? I'm not a constructive thinker, and I wouldn't say that I can offer. So I'll yield to my other co-panelists on this.
Yeah, I think this also kind of to tie in that previous question, in my previous response is people are continuing to choose these things, right? People are continuing to choose these things. So I think one thing that we can do is just really, really say something about it. Whenever one of your friends says some fucked up shit, say something about it. Like, what? I mean, if somebody at your church is saying something homophobic, be like, yo, what are you talking? That's wild. What are you talking about? I think that's one step. And then to the question of European Jesus as a wider system of white supremacy, I think that's, yes, I think absolutely. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about this particularly is through the ways that Fanon thinks about collective catharsis. And that's a really important thing that I think something goes awry. Part of the process of alienation, in terms of racial alienation that Fanon brings up, involves Black kids seeing themselves in the role of the colonizer through cartoons, through all of these different things. So that's part of where this alienation comes from, is through this sort of putting yourself in the colonizer's shoes. So I think it really, really something goes awry whenever we think about this ahistorical white Jesus, especially for colonized people. So steps, I have no idea, but like I said, I think part of this is the continued conversation about what this looks like if you are in a church community, and how we're talking about it in the immediate relationships, interpersonal relationships, as we discover the different ways that misogyny and patriarchy and transphobia and Islamophobia and all of these different things that are happening in church spaces are occurring. I think that we have a responsibility to intervene in certain sorts of ways, whether or not we're effective in it. I think that's also part of the practice, is getting better at having more effective conversations and building rhetoric around trying to also get people to think about decoloniality and the ways that we are in the world in relationship to other people. So
I do want to say that one thing which would not be a sufficient step, if I might, Anna. So I don't think that kind of populating churches with Black Jesuses or getting people to sing. I'm not saying that you're saying that, Steve. Oh, okay. But anyway, or singing Korean hymns is going to kind of ameliorate the condition of what, white dominated sensibilities in churches and so on. I think that there's a kind of tourism. There's a way in which cultural tourism can kind of be part of the white Christian imaginary when activities like that occur and when uses of racial images. In other words, it's not sufficient just the displacement of white practices with other practices. It's about also kind of deploying those practices in contexts in ways that make sense. So I don't have concrete prescriptions for that, but I do know that we have a lot of people here, participants who I know are active in the MDiv program at the University of Chicago and in my classes, and probably be more well-equipped to answer that question.
I also want to jump in because when I teach, I always include art and music. And so last year, I taught a class that is called Christology and Cultural Imagination. I introduced to students that, yes, the white images of Jesus, but I also introduced to them different kinds of images in pop culture and in arts from other parts of the world. So it is not just the white image of Jesus. It is whether to become Christian, we have to step into the cultural world and remain there. That is really the question. Are we speaking theology from a white tongue? Well, I'm very sad to say I teach theology, and I have looked at sample syllabi of many of my colleagues in the United States, 18 syllabi of introducing theology to students. Most of these syllabi, as you can imagine, would be talking about white theologians. And towards the end, if the class still has time, you throw in James Cone, a Black theologian, or Gustavo Gutierrez, the famous liberation theologian from Peru. That's it. So you discipline the student's mind according to the white logic that Derrida calls logocentrism. And after the mind is saturated with that grammar and that white tongue, it is very difficult to hear other voices and thinking that they are doing theology. The woman can do theology, but they need to qualify what they are doing. Feminist theology. The Asians are doing something. Well, we cannot just call it theology. You have to label your theology Asian theology. And your courses will be elective. Those people who want to take, they take it. Not required. The white tongue should be mastered by everyone, or at least as the foundation. So when our mind is so disciplined, to dislodge ourselves from that cultural world is so challenging. Not only that, the sad part of it is we begin to police others. I have assimilated to the white world. You have not, so you are lagging behind. We criticize others. We policed other people's theological imagination. Isn't this sad? Very sad. And that is why I think instead of monocultural, monologic, we must embrace diversity and treat it as something that is enlivening and renewing. And as Angie said, we need to avoid putting other cultures as ornament, isn't it? Yes, this is still the master's house. But yeah, hang a lantern from China or something, you see that sculpture from Africa, make our master's house even more beautiful. Well, that will not do. And that is why how to debunk our mind is so important. Otherwise, we impoverished ourselves. Not knowing other tongues would be something we need to mourn because we impoverished ourselves. Look at United States. It's only in this country that most people cannot speak two languages. You go outside, in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, multilingual. Once you are multilingual, you are invited to go to another cultural world. We need to become multi-religious in our thinking too. And that is why in my book, forthcoming book, Postcolonial Politics and Theology, I propose a postcolonial and comparative understanding of politics and theology. We need to keep on broaden our imagination if I'm really going to respond to the crisis of our world.
Wonderful, wonderful answers for that one. And I think especially helpful to be talking about how ornamentation in some way makes churches feel absolved of the process that we've been talking about. I think that's a very important point to make. I think as we've touched on, I think Dr. Heo, you touched on it a little bit, and certainly Dr. Kwok, you talked about it a little. I think, Steve, when you were speaking about epistemologies, this was certainly an issue. Adrian, if you could possibly keep pasting in the chat, I would absolutely love that. We have a question: what are the roles of divinity schools and seminaries in the process of decolonization? I think, you know, to maybe broaden this question a little bit, when students are in a position where they are deferring to the institution and deferring to their teachers, you know, what are they supposed to do when it comes to this process?
This is a really tough question. And I think I mean, I think universities and seminaries, and I think I should speak in general terms. I'm not speaking about the University of Chicago in particular. I just want to make that clear. But you know, there are different steps that are being taken. I understand, for example, some seminaries are engaged in reparation considerations. So on a financial level, interested in kind of addressing the colonial legacies on financial registers. I know that generally seminaries and universities are participating in conversations about decolonizing the canon. But what that looks like is I do think we need a bit of more robust conversation about what assumptions need to be exposed and dealt with in order to decolonize syllabi, even the kind of, dare I say it, natural flow of coursework, you know, the way that the courses are understood to build upon each other. Dr. Kwok had just mentioned how sometimes you will be in kind of encountering syllabi where the kind of difference appears abruptly at the end of a syllabus after following kind of the logic of the hegemonic tongue, the white tongue, to extend the metaphor. So I think these are all so epistemic, financial. I hope that seminaries and universities will work towards what it would look like to actively recruit a student body that represents the diversity of the US, but also for the American Academy, the American Empire abroad, that is their responsibilities to the places that we've intervened in, to those generations, to those lost generations who have kind of experienced war as a result of American military occupation abroad. So I think, to expand our imagination of responsibility, the American Academy, that would also be an interesting task, but I haven't participated. I haven't seen those conversations take place yet, but it's something that I think might be a good direction to go in.
Man, this is a complicated question for me. I think part of the problem is the bullshitting that happens around these questions too. I can't speak to what's happening at the University of Chicago, but I mean, just recently we see Brother West gets denied tenure at Harvard Divinity School, ends up going back to Union Seminary. The very next week, what does the Harvard Divinity School faculty come out and support? Divestment. Divesting the endowment from the prison industrial complex. Students have been pushing that for decades. Yet you need to look good in the media whenever you lose your star Black faculty member because you deny him tenure. So you come out and you say, look at what we're doing. We're really progressive. When students have been literally talking about this, I mean, I sat in, I don't think Dean Hempton is the dean anymore, but a couple of years ago, I sat in his office and had a heart-to-heart conversation with him about how they were not speaking out against police violence when a Black student was beaten naked in Harvard Square. I said, why do I have to come to you to tell you that you need to speak about this thing that happened last night? So that becomes this conversation, well, we don't know when to step in and we don't know how to do this. And it becomes a responsibility on those Black and brown students that you come in to tokenize in your pamphlets, rather than actually listening to them and incorporating some of the things that we've been talking about for decades. And I think a part of this is uniting. What do the roles play? How can we collectively come to better as people that are associated with these sorts of institutions across lines of alumni, grad students, faculty, workers? How's your dining hall facility? What's your dining worker situation look like at the Div School at UChicago? How are they involved in this conversation about what decolonization looks like? How are they being shit on and undervalued and exploited and so forth? So yeah, I think I don't. What is the role? I don't know. Abolish yourself. What is the role of like a branded divinity school? What does this mean? I think that there's definitely helpful things that these institutions bear, but also like there's a lot of violence that goes with the very continuation of the name Harvard Divinity School. Like, what does that mean in the world? In a school built by slavery, how do you say sorry for that? You can't say sorry for that and still exist with a $50 billion endowment. What are y'all doing? Invested in the colonization of Puerto Rico? What are the endowment? And then not giving anyone access to any of this information. So part of it is like, how do we actually unify around what is happening? Where's the money going? How are people being paid? What does this all look like? And how do we think about the material conditions and the coloniality that these universities and specifically divinity schools continue to perpetuate in the guise of moral good, in the guise of we're doing great, we're pluralistic. And I'll leave it at this. There's an interesting AAR article came out a couple of years ago called The Grammar of Racism, about the rise of Black studies at Harvard, particularly at the Divinity School, that I will share in the chat. That might be helpful for folks to think about this, because pluralism becomes the name brand of Harvard's Divinity School in order to quell Black unrest. So it's really, really interesting, the back and forth and the dialectics that are happening at these levels, like the example that I showed with West and the faculty coming out against or in support of divestment. So I will leave it there. I'm clearly very salty about the role that universities play in perpetuating coloniality.
I want to say that theological education in the United States is really are facing tremendous challenges. I just named two. One, declining of support for theological education. That means financial and institutional support. The second one will be the, in some schools, the decline of enrollment too. Why? Because as we all know that mainline churches are not growing. If the membership of mainline white denominations declining, chances are there are not so many students wanting to go to divinity school or supported by their congregations to do so. And because theological educators are thinking very hard about how to meet the current challenges, and this book that just came out last year was so important. That is Dr. James Jennings' After Whiteness, an Education of Belonging. There was one line that I would never forget after reading this book. That is, for some of the racial minority students who are in divinity school, they are almost like serving a prison sentence. That is, they can't wait to get out of it. Instead of seeing their education process as liberating, it's as if they have to enter a white prison. But they need the certification for ordination or to be a leader of community. They stay there and wait until it's done. Oh, I said, imagine that metaphor, prison sentence. This is really existential challenge for someone like me who have been in theological education for over 3 decades. And that is why I always tell the students, education should be self-motivated and directed. You cannot go to theological schools answering other people's questions. People go to divinity school for what? For many purposes, but at least they have a vocation. They want to do something with their lives. They shouldn't be then enter into a white prison. Instead, they should be given the opportunities and the capacities to try their version of truth and to tell their story and to renew their relationship with God. I imagine theological educators answer that call too, but they may understand it differently. For me, education, if it is not liberating, it is not for emancipation, we are not drawing out, which is the Latin root of education, educate. Instead, we are pumping in, okay? And we are competing with many things. The mass media, all these sports, and so many different things. Why students need to listen to me? I always wonder. We need to enable them to see the richness of the emancipatory potential of Christianity in the past. What are Christians who are for justice, who are doing what Steve would want them to do, doing in different parts of the world? How, as the upcoming generation, they receive the wisdom from our generation and carry on the race. I still have high hope for theological education because we are still talking about justice, morality. We are still talking about God's care for creation. What other schools are talking about it? Okay, where are those spaces that still allowed progressive voices to say something? And I hope theological schools, divinity schools, can be one of those rare places in the United States today that the prophets can still speak, even crying in the wilderness.
Beautiful. I think we have time for one last question before we have to depart, out of respect for our lovely panelists and for our attendees. It's a long one, so grip your seat if you need to. What are some practical ways that local faith communities can ethically engage with academic, Global South theologies? Should religious leaders be teaching them in seminaries and then, be taught them in seminaries and then pass them on to their future communities, regardless of community culture and identity? Should Global South feminist theologies be sent to women's Bible studies and Muslim women's groups?
I'm just going to defer to my colleagues because I'm not a theologian or a practitioner. So I just going to make that clear, because I see this as a constructive question.
Maybe let me just begin briefly, and then I invite my other speakers to chime in too. Very often we think what we are discussing about decolonizing all these things are so abstract. We in the University of Chicago can talk about it. In local churches, we may not have the opportunity or equipped. But we are global, isn't it? Today, in those local congregations, do you have people who lose their job because the job moved to Southeast Asia, to China? Isn't it global? How do you talk about the pandemic when we faced so many of those poorer countries in the world? They have not even had one dose of the vaccine. Isn't it connected? You don't need to talk about high-sounding issues. You talk about questions we together faced and see in what way we can be connected. Remember, we impoverished ourselves by not knowing what other Christians in other parts of the world are talking about the gospel. Mark Warren said, it needs the whole world to know the whole gospel. And why should we be just focusing myopically on the United States without broadening our horizon? We listen to music, we watch news that talk about other parts of the world. Why Christianity would not be global, would not care for those people who are struggling? If we touch the wonder heart of God, we will be able to connect with others wherever we are.
Thanks for that. I can't speak to the theological components of this, but I read this as almost more so a pedagogical question. And I think this is important to think about. Should religious leaders be taught them in seminaries and pass them on to their future communities? This reads to me like what Paulo Freire might call banking education and a banking system of education, and I'm not sure that that is the best way to go about coloniality. So part of this, for me, to the first question is like, well, in what ways are local faith groups already doing this shit that are outside of your own church? Who's around the corner talking about this? How can we embed that, be in better conversation and community and relationships with the people that we're not going to church with? I don't particularly share Christian sensibilities, but I'm around a lot of Christian communities, particularly in the South. And I think this is a really important question. How can you bring in people from these other communities, value their time and energy in certain sorts of ways, materially even, and be in communication with folks on their own terms? Do women's Bible studies and Muslim women's groups want these feminist theologies? Is feminist theology even a helpful way to think about it in a Muslim women's group? Maybe ask them, maybe have that conversation and start that conversation as a practice of community care and actually have an intersubjective relationship and start building these Creole sorts of movements that I spoke about based on love that we talked about in the beginning. I don't need to save anyone. I don't need to preach to anyone. I don't need to give people knowledge that they already have. Like I think we need to have better conversations and take care of each other. And I don't think that the idea that we can just go in and put little bits of knowledge in people and they'll change. I don't think that's the way that it works. So as a pedagogical imperative, I would think more about what a more liberatory pedagogical praxis might look like in terms of theological education and how we can engage with these things in intersubjective communal sorts of ways.
Wonderful. This has been a fantastic conversation to be involved in. I deeply, deeply appreciate all of your comments and just feel honored to be in this virtual space with you. To those who attended and, you know, their gears are starting to shift a little bit and they want more, there is someone from, I believe, Yale Divinity School coming. His name is Willie Jennings. There's going to be an event on race and religion on April 22nd at 7 p.m. All of this information will be in our newsletter. It'll be on our social media, all of those things. But as of right now, I can't express enough my gratitude, panelists, for your time and your just articulateness in these responses. Justin, would you like to see everyone off?
Sure. I mean, it's a tough act to follow, but yeah, I just also want to echo Anna and just say thank you to all the panelists for such wonderful, thoughtful, and enriching discussion. This was a really wonderful event. If folks either want to react using the reaction button or unmute themselves and give a round of applause to our panelists, I think that would definitely be appropriate. It was such a phenomenal event.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Great, thanks for having us. I learned a lot.
And with that, yeah, I think we will close out. Thank you all so much for coming and have a wonderful rest of your evening. And yeah, have a wonderful rest of the week.
You too.
Thanks for having me, y'all. Have a blessed spring.